So if there was a poll taken of Bible students to determine which passage in the Bible, which passage in Scripture is the most perplexing and enigmatic, I believe that first place would go to a short interlude of 3 verses which occur in the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus that we'll be studying tonight. Let's set the stage. The family of Jacob relocated to Egypt in order to escape a terrible famine that was taking place in the land of Canaan where they were living. At first, the Egyptians were quite welcoming, but as the nascent Israelite nation began to increase in numbers, Egypt grew fearful and began to enslave them and eventually launched a murderous campaign of killing all the male children. The parents of Moses, who had just been born, floated him down the Nile River in a basket in order to avert this decree. Baby Moses was found, ironically, by the daughter of Pharaoh, who had instituted this policy of genocide, and Moses was raised in the royal palace. Moses grows up, and one day he goes out to see his brethren. He knew that he was of Israelite stock, and he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man. Moses rises up and strikes down the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. Eventually, this became known. The word got out that Moses had killed an Egyptian, and he became a wanted man. So he flees to a place called Midian, where he marries the daughter of the high priest named Jethro, and he becomes a shepherd. One day, while tending the flocks, God appears to Moses in a vision at a burning bush. And God tells Moses that he is aware, that God is aware of the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, and he is going to send Moses to confront Pharaoh and liberate the children of Israel from Egypt. Moses is very resistant to assuming this responsibility, and he presents a number of objections. After a while, Moses finally takes his wife Zipporah and their 2 sons. He mounts them on a donkey, and they head down to Egypt. And then, seemingly out of the blue, we come to our shocking episode. In chapter 4 of Exodus, verses 24 through 26, we read the following. And it came to pass on the way at the inn that the Lord encountered him and sought to kill him. So Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and threw it at his feet and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him go. And then she said, "A bridegroom of blood you are because of the circumcision." And we are left scratching our heads. We're confronted with an incredible number of difficult questions. First of all, God had just chosen Moses for a vital mission. And Moses is on his way down to Egypt, seemingly to fulfill that mission. Why is God now seeking to kill him? Secondly, what did Moses do to deserve this? We can't really see anything terrible that he did after his encounter with God at the burning bush. What's going on here? Of course, if Moses did something truly terrible that would warrant his death, that would seem to disqualify him as God's messenger. And then, what is the significance of the circumcision here? And why would Zipporah think that this would be helpful here? Why would she think this would be the thing to do? Equally puzzling are Zipporah's declarations. What is the meaning of her saying, "Surely a bridegroom of blood you are to me," and then a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision? And who is she saying this to? The text is not clear. When we do a deeper dive into this story, the passage is brimming with ambiguous pronouns and peculiar phrases, and it seems to come out of nowhere. The text itself, this little tiny story, this interlude, doesn't seem to belong in the bigger picture. It has no clear context. Let's just point out a few of these additional problems. The text says God sought to kill him. Who is this referring to? Who is it that God is seeking to kill? It doesn't say that God sought to kill Moses. Is Moses the intended victim? Or is it one of his sons? And if so, which one of his sons? Secondly, how exactly did God try to kill whoever it was that he was seeking to kill? You don't really see what's happening in this text. It just says God sought to kill him. Well, what's going on? What would you have seen if you were there? What would you have seen to indicate there was a murder about to take place? Thirdly, Zipporah circumcised her son. But which son? And why wasn't this son already circumcised? Again, the text is not clear. The text doesn't name which of her two sons she circumcised. And then Zipporah throws the foreskin at his feet. At whose feet? Text is not clear. Is she throwing the foreskin at the feet of Moses? At the feet of one of her sons? There might even be another character here. If we assume, as the Midrash does, that there was an angel that was sent to kill Moses, maybe she threw the foreskin at the feet of this angel. It's not clear in the text whose feet she's throwing the foreskin at. The text says that after she did this, the text says, he let him go. He let him go. Who let him go? And who is the him? Who is let go? And who is the one that's letting go? And letting go from what? Did he have him in some kind of a chokehold or a headlock? It's not clear what's going on here. There are many other questions, but let's just go with these for now. And the truth is that there is no uniform approach to these difficulties among our traditional commentaries. There are sages that support a wide spectrum of interpretations that include virtually every possible angle. Tonight, we'll consider two approaches. One, which is the most widely held understanding, and the other, a very novel and creative approach. It seems that the most likely intended victim in this story is Moses. Just a straightforward reading of the text, it seems that Moses is the one that's about to be killed. Because in the previous paragraphs leading up to this story, God has been engaged in a dialogue with Moses. And our passage begins by telling us that God encountered him and sought to kill him. So God had been engaged in a dialogue with Moses, and now we're told, and God encountered him and sought to kill him. It just makes sense that the context seems to indicate that God intended to kill Moses. In addition, while it's difficult to understand at this point, why would God want to take the life of Moses? There could have been a reason. I mean, we can imagine that maybe Moses did something. But it's impossible. If it's difficult to understand God taking the life of Moses, it would be impossible to understand why God would seek to kill Moses' uncircumcised son, because infants are obviously never culpable or responsible for their behavior. So if God was about to kill Moses, the question is why? And once again, the context provides us with some direction. We see that Zipporah reacts to the crisis by circumcising their son. And that immediately resolves the crisis. It resolves the threat to Moses' life. So it seems reasonable to assume that circumcision is a critical element to this story. Our passage here in Exodus is analyzed in the Talmud, in Tractate Nidarim, page 31b to 32a. And this is what the Talmud says. Rabbi Yehoshua Ben Karcha teaches, "Great is the commandment of circumcision. For despite all the meritorious deeds performed by Moses, our teacher, when he displayed apathy toward the commandment of circumcision by not circumcising his newly born son Eliezer, none of his merits protected him, and God sought to kill him." So Rabbi Yehoshua Ben Karcha says straight out that God sought to kill Moses because Moses neglected the commandment of circumcision. Now, in response to this, Rabbi Yosi says, God forbid to say that Moses neglected the commandment of circumcision. God forbid to say such a thing. But Rabbi Yosi explains that Moses found himself in a quandary. Moses thought to himself the following: if I circumcise him immediately, meaning right before we go to Egypt, and then I proceed immediately after the circumcision to journey to Egypt, the child's life will be in danger for 3 days, because on the 3rd day is when the pain is the greatest from circumcision. And we know that during the 40 years in the desert, the Israelites did not circumcise for 40 years. It's not until they get to the land of Canaan and they're entering with Joshua that they all get circumcised. Why didn't they circumcise for those 40 years? Because we're told that they would break camp and travel at the word of God, and they did not know when they would be traveling. So the problem was that if a child was circumcised, they could theoretically have to travel that day or the next day, and that would be dangerous. It's dangerous to travel after circumcision. So because of that, for those 40 years, no one was circumcised. So he said to himself, Moshe says to himself, if I circumcise him right now, and I proceed immediately on the journey to Egypt, the child's life will be in danger for 3 days. If, on the other hand, I circumcise him and then wait for 3 days, I'll be violating the commandment of God to return to Egypt now. He found himself now in a bind. What am I supposed to do? He's like Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. On the one hand, I have to fulfill God's commandment to go down to Egypt. On the other hand, I don't want to put my child's life in danger. Therefore, what did Moses decide to do? He chose to obey the command of God to go to Egypt. And he intended to circumcise the baby as soon as an opportunity would present itself. There was no apathy on the part of Moses regarding the commandment of circumcision. Rabbi Yosi says, God forbid to even think such a thing. Rabbi Yosi explains that Moses was in a bind. He either way, he was going to be facing a problem. So he makes the decision to take the commandment of God seriously, to go to Egypt to redeem Israel, and he'll have to circumcise his son when they have a chance, and it will be safe. Moses, according to Rabbi Yosi, correctly decided that his first duty was to return to Egypt immediately and to then perform the circumcision when it would be safe to do so. So Rabbi Yosi in the Talmud now asks the following question. So why then was Moses threatened with death? It seems that he had done the reasonable thing, the correct thing. So why was God seeking to kill him? So Rabbi Yosi explains that when they came close to Egypt, they got very close to Egypt, Moses busied himself with the matters of the lodging place. They were going to stop over in an inn and rest before they finally got to Egypt. They're just very close now. And he got involved with checking into the inn. We know what it's like to check into a hotel. You don't go straight to your room. So he was checking in, he was arranging the food, the meals. That's what he was doing. And Rabbi Yosi says, no, he should have first, at this stage, at this point, immediately performed the commandment of circumcision as soon as he was able to. They pull into the parking lot of this inn, go into the lobby of this motel, circumcise the baby right there, and then involve yourself with the lodgings. So we can understand why Rabbi Yosi sought to minimize Moses' sin as opposed to the way Rabbi Yoshua Ben Karcha understood the story. Again, Rabbi Yoshua Ben Karcha has a very tremendous accusation against Moses. He says Moses simply disregarded the whole commandment of circumcision. And Rabbi Yosi says, no, God forbid. Moses wanted to do it. His plan was to do it as soon as it became feasible and it would be safe. But he delayed a few minutes, meaning that he checked into the motel and arranged the lodgings before he performed the circumcision. And that's why he was facing death. So we understand why Rabbi Yosi would want to minimize Moses' sin. Of course you want to minimize the sin of Moses. You don't want to have an outstandingly terrible sin that Moses is accused of. The problem is, but by portraying Moses in a more positive light, it makes the attack on his life much more difficult to understand. So we might be able to understand God deciding to attack Moses because Moses literally has disregarded a central commandment of the Torah. But according to Rabbi Yosi, he didn't disregard it. He was intending to do it as soon as it became safe. So it's much more difficult to understand, according to Rabbi Yosi, why God has decided to kill Moses. And again, what Rabbi Yosi is forced to say is that Moses delayed a little bit more than he needed to. And clearly, there is an element of noblesse oblige operating here, that more is expected of great people. When you're on a great high level, more is expected of you, and the expectations of God are tremendously demanding. Now, what emerges from Rabbi Yosi's understanding of our story is the critical importance of alacrity and zeal when it comes to performing God's commandments. When the opportunity arises to carry out a commandment of God, we need to attend to it with single-minded focus as soon as possible, not to delay at all, even a few minutes. Now, I'm going to share a terrifying example of this from the Talmud that concerns a famous person known as Nakum ish Gamzu. Nakum ish Gamzu. I just want to introduce this character with another story from the Talmud. The Talmud introduces us to him in Tractate Sanhedrin 109a. And the Talmud says that he had the practice that whatever would happen to him in life, meaning no matter how bad things were, he would always say, Gam zu latova, which means this too is for the best. He would always say this. And he became known as Nakum. Nakum was his name. Ish Gamzu, the man who would say, Gamzu, this is also for the best. So one day, we're told, the Jewish community wanted to send a gift to the Caesar. And they decided to send it with Nakum, Ish Gamzu, because God often performed miracles for him. Many miracles were performed for this Nakum Ish Gamzu. The Jewish community felt it'll be a good idea to send the gift to Caesar through him. So he arrived on the way to the Caesar. He came to an inn, and he wanted to stay overnight. It was maybe a long trip. He takes a rest overnight at an inn, and the other people in the inn, they ask him what he had in the chest that he was carrying. What's in that chest that you're carrying? And he said it was a gift for the Caesar. I guess that was a mistake. So in the middle of the night, the other guests broke into his room. They opened the chest, and they removed all of the contents of the chest and filled it with sand. They didn't want him to immediately think that the chest was empty, right? He'd become suspicious, so they just filled it up with sand so he would think nothing happened. When Nakum arrived at the Caesar's palace, they opened the chest, and they found dirt inside. Caesar angrily shouted, "The Jews are mocking me." And they took Nakum out to be killed. And he said what? As they were leading him out to be killed, he said, Gamzu latova, this is also for the best. However, Elijah the prophet shows up in this story, and he appeared to the Romans disguised as one of them. And he said to the Romans, this dirt might be from the dirt of Abraham the patriarch. This might be his dirt. And Elijah explained that Abraham would throw dirt at his enemies, and it would turn into swords. And he would throw straw at his enemies, and it would turn into arrows. So the Romans, they tested it. The Romans said, we'll see what happens. And it worked. It worked. Pretty amazing dirt. And so there was a district that the Romans had been unable to conquer. They were having a very difficult time with a particular district, and they took this dirt to battle this place, and they were victorious. The dirt won the day for the Romans. And so they took Nakum into the treasury, and they told him, take whatever you want. They put him into the royal treasury. They told Nakum, take whatever you want. And he filled his chest with gold. Filled it with gold. And they sent him off with great honor. Now on the way home, he stopped again at the inn where he had been robbed previously. And the guests asked him, what did you do to the emperor? What happened there that you deserve so much honor? What took place in the emperor's palace that you got so much honor? What did you bring? What did you give to them? Because they thought in their mind he gave them dirt. They couldn't imagine why he'd be honored. And so they asked him, what did you bring to the emperor's palace to deserve such honor? And Nakum said, whatever I took from here is what I brought there. So the guests now are thinking, wow, you bring dirt to the emperor, to the Caesar, and you're going to make off like a bandit. So the guests took some dirt from the inn, and they brought it to the Caesar. And when the Romans tested this dirt, and they saw that it was worthless, they executed these people. Now, this was all by way of introduction to illustrate that Nakum Ish Gamzu was a great person. But the story that has a bearing on our discussion in Exodus chapter 4 is from another passage in the Talmud. It's from Tractate Ta'anit 21a. The Talmud there tells us that at a certain point in his life, Nakum was blind in both eyes. He was missing both his arms and missing both his legs, and his entire body was covered with boils. And he was lying in a dilapidated house, and the legs of his bed were placed in buckets of water so that ants would not be able to crawl up the legs of the bed and onto his boils. Now, because this house was in terrible condition and in danger of collapsing, Nakum's students wanted to move him to a safer place. So they planned to carry out his bed, and then, after they removed him, they were going to go back and remove the other furniture and the rest of Nakum's possessions. But Nakum said to them, no. First carry out the rest of my furniture, carry out my other possessions, and then take me out. Because, he said, as long as I am in the house, you can be assured that it will not collapse. So they followed his instructions, and first they removed his other furniture and his possessions, and then they removed him in his bed, and as soon as they removed him, the house collapsed. His students gasped, and they said, "Our teacher, if you are so righteous, why did all of this terrible suffering come upon you?" And Nakum answered them, "My sons, I brought it all upon myself." He says, "I was once traveling on the road to my father-in-law's house with 3 donkey loads of provisions. One donkey carried food, one carried drink, and the other carried fine delicacies. A poor man came, stood before me on the road, and said, 'My master, please give me something to eat.' So I said to him, 'Wait until I unload the donkey.' But before I was able to unload the donkey, the man passed away. I fell upon his face, and I declared, 'Let my eyes, which took no pity on your eyes, let them go blind. Let my hands, which took no pity on your hands, let them be cut off. Let my legs, which took no pity on your legs, let them be cut off.' And I still could not calm myself until I added, 'And let my entire body be covered with boils.'" Now, what do you see from this story? Nakum had the opportunity to save someone's life, but he didn't move quickly enough. He didn't approach this occasion with sufficient urgency. He allowed his opportunity to evaporate. He didn't need to first unload his entire donkey. This was a crisis. He should have immediately reached for the first food available and give it to the starving man. It was because of this lack of alacrity that he exhibited that Nakum was so hard on himself. This frightening story parallels Rabbi Yosi's understanding of Moses' indiscretion. Because Moses busied himself just for a few minutes with the lodgings rather than immediately circumcising his son, And because of Moses' greatness, he was held to a higher standard. Moses almost had to pay the ultimate price. Now, I said I wanted to share a second approach to this story, and this is a very creative interpretation by Rabbi Tzvi Dov Kanatopsky. If you remember, I introduced Rabbi Kanatopsky last week in our discussion of the very difficult story of the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, the high priest. Rabbi Kanatopsky's analysis of our story tonight in Exodus is somewhat daring. But in my research, I found that one of the early great Torah commentaries, Rabbi Yosef ibn Kaspi, 14th century scholar from Provence, he takes a somewhat similar approach. So Rabbi Kanatopsky was an American rabbi in the 20th century. We might want to maybe dismiss him, but what he came up with seems quite similar to that of one of the early great Torah commentaries. What Rabbi Kanatopsky does is to review the Talmud's interpretation that we've previously discussed. But he finds it wanting. First of all, the Talmud itself presents compelling reasons for why Moses did not circumcise his son immediately. And even if Moses should have done it immediately upon arriving at the inn, the Torah has no penalty of death for failing to circumcise one's son. There are death penalties for many things in the Torah, desecrating the Sabbath, murdering someone, but there's no death penalty for failing to circumcise your son. The only penalty, actually, is for the uncircumcised person himself, if they fail to undergo the ritual after reaching adulthood. But for the father, there's no penalty. So Rabbi Kanatopsky finds it very hard to understand the idea that Moses somehow deserved to die for not circumcising his son immediately. Instead, Rabbi Kanatopsky looks back to the context of the episode itself in light of what came before. Back in verse 18 of chapter 4 in Exodus, Moses informs his father-in-law, Jethro, of his intention to return to Egypt. Tells his father-in-law, I'm going back to Egypt. And he says he wants to go to see whether his brethren are still alive. This is what he tells Jethro. And Jethro gives his blessings for a safe journey. But Rabbi Kanatopsky points out that Moses doesn't mention anything to his father-in-law about going to fulfill a mission that God chose for him to carry out. And the question is why? Why doesn't Moses mention anything about going before Pharaoh to demand that he free the Israelites? Doesn't say a word to his father-in-law. In the next verse, verse 19, we seem to have a verse that's out of place. Here in this verse, God orders Moses to return to Egypt. But shouldn't this have come before Moses' announcement in the previous verse that he plans to go back to Egypt? It's very peculiar. In verse 18, Moses tells his father-in-law, I'm going back to Egypt. So why in verse 19 does God command Moses to go back to Egypt? It seems to be the wrong way around. The verses should have been switched. And if you look at verse 19, the reason that God gives him to return to Egypt in verse 19 is strange. God says to Moses in verse 19 to return to Egypt because the people who had been seeking to harm him are all dead. They've all died. Don't forget, that's why Moses ended up in Midian, because he killed the Egyptian that was beating the Jew. He was a wanted man in Egypt, and he flees to Midian. God tells him, well, those people that were seeking your life, they're dead. And that's why you can go back to Egypt. The problem is, if Moses was to go back at this point to perform a divine mission, the fact that it's safe now to return shouldn't be that relevant. When you're on a mission from God, you go even if it's dangerous, and you trust that God will protect you. So what is this God telling him, this almost irrelevant reason? In the next verse, verse 20, again we have a very peculiar construction. It begins by saying that Moses took his wife and his sons. He placed them on a donkey, and he headed out to Egypt. That's what the verse says. But then, almost as an afterthought, it says that he took his staff with him. That's a strange way of writing the verse. It should have said he took his wife and his sons and his staff, and he headed down to Egypt. But the verse doesn't say that. The verse says that he took his wife and his sons, placed them on a donkey, and headed down to Egypt. And then, almost as if God forgot something in the verse says, and he took his staff with him. Strange verse. And the next verse, verse 21, has the same kind of problem. God suddenly, now in verse 21, begins to advise Moses about his mission and how he should carry it out. But shouldn't this have come, again, prior to Moses setting out on the journey? Why does God only begin to tell Moses about the importance of carrying out his mission after Moses has already started to go back to Egypt? This speech that God makes in verse 21 should have come before Moses heads down to Egypt. So Rabbi Kanatopsky explains that when we go back to the very beginning of the story, when Moses encounters God at the burning bush, we know and we see that Moses is very resistant to accepting the assignment God wants to give him. His initial reaction, if you go back to the beginning of the story, is, "Who am I?" Moses says. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should take the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Now we know that Moses was the humblest person that ever lived. And maybe that's what's going on here. Like, who am I? I'm not qualified. What are you choosing me for? But this is the initial, immediate reaction of Moses. You want me to go down? What? And confront Pharaoh? And take the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I that I should confront Pharaoh? Who am I that I should take the children of Israel out of Egypt? What does God do? God assures Moses, "I will be with you. Don't worry. I'm not just sending you on a suicide mission. I'm going to be with you," God says. What does Moses respond? "Well, the Israelites are not going to believe that you sent me. They're not going to believe. They're going to think I'm crazy. God sent you to confront Pharaoh and take us out of slavery?" Moses says the Israelites will never believe me. So what does God do? God provides Moses with various miraculous signs that he can demonstrate to the Israelites his credibility. What does Moses do? Again, he protests. And he says, "Look, God, I don't speak well. I have a speech impediment. What are you sending me to go down and speak to Pharaoh? I don't speak well." And God tells Moses, "I'll teach you how to speak. Don't worry, it'll be okay. And Moses continues to resist. And he pleads with God, send someone else, he says to God. At this point, God becomes furious with Moses. And he tells him that his brother Aaron is going to meet him in the desert, and Aaron is going to be the spokesperson. You don't speak well, don't worry. Aaron is going to be the one that speaks. But after all of this haggling, after all of this back and forth, and despite God's anger, despite that Moses has provoked God, Moses never agrees to accept the mission. Moses never signs on the dotted line. When you read the story, does not agree. And he never says to God, okay, I will go. I will accept your assignment. However, Rabbi Kopski proposes that the prophecy, the experience that Moses had at the burning bush, must have had some impact on him. It must have troubled him. I mean, how can I just ignore God? I mean, he knows what's been going on. He knows that he's been having this back and forth with God. And even though I've refused, but I mean, who am I arguing with? I'm arguing with the creator of the world. And so this experience that he had must have been weighing, the experience that Moses had must have been weighing on his mind. So what does Moses do? He tells his father-in-law, I am going to travel to Egypt. Me, just me. I'm going to travel to Egypt to see how my brethren are doing. That's all he says. And when he leaves, this is all he intends to do. All he intends to do is to take a visit. To take a visit down to Egypt to see what's doing with the Jewish people. So at this point, God appears to Moses and says to him, you know, you shouldn't just go down there to visit. You should actually return to live there with your brethren, because the reason that you fled is no longer relevant, because the people that were seeking your life, they're no longer alive, they're all dead. So God provides Moses with a reason that don't just go and take a week and visit Egypt. You should just move back there. There's no reason for you to remain in Midian any longer. So initially, when Moses was intending just to visit Egypt, he was going to go by himself. But after God tells him this reason for moving back, Moses now takes his wife and his sons. This again is very clear when you read the text. But at this point, after taking his wife and sons and intending to move back to Egypt, almost as an afterthought, he takes the staff of God with him. Now, this staff is clearly not just a staff. This is a sign of leadership. It's a sign of divine mission. And this action, the fact that Moses takes this staff, hints, it's a hint, that Moses is still considering the possibility of accepting God's mission to become the Redeemer of Israel. So now that Moses has taken his staff, the sequence of verses makes perfect sense. Seeing now that Moses might be open to the mission, God appears to him again. And God reviews the major outline now of the mission itself. And God dramatically presents the thrust of the mission to Moses and urges Moses to finally accept it. And next we find Moses and his family resting at an inn. Now, perhaps they're at the inn to fulfill the commandment of circumcision, which now is an appropriate time. They're very close to Egypt. It will now not be dangerous to travel to Egypt after the circumcision. It's going to be a very short trip. And here, that Moses is not traveling. We know that traveling is not easy. He's not in an Uber. He's on donkey. I mean, it's very difficult to travel through the desert. Now he's at an inn. He has a chance to stop and rest and to think. And here, God appears to Moses and wants to put him to death. Rabbi Kanatopsky, as well as, again, Ibn Kaspi, reads these words figuratively, not literally. And they suggest the following. They suggest that the tension and the anxiety that Moses has been experiencing about whether or not to accept God's mission has now reached a boiling point. Moses is racked by excruciating questions about who he is. He has doubts about his own adequacy. And he couldn't take this tension any longer. He's about to explode. And he experiences God as trying to kill him. We've all used this expression. You know, when a person is making your life very difficult, you say, "You're killing me." That's what Moses experiences. The tensions that Moses was experiencing reached the point where the torment was threatening his life. On the one hand, he's fearful that he's not capable of carrying out this mission. Yet, on the other hand, God is insisting that he do so. His own humility and lack of self-confidence are standing in the way of taking on this mission. But his concern for the suffering of his brethren is tormenting him. How can I not go? At the inn, he's able to reflect on these questions, and the tensions begin tearing him apart, threatening his life. At this point, Zipporah sees the crisis that her husband is having, and probably understanding what's behind her husband's crisis, she does something dramatic and says something dramatic that ends the tension that's been plaguing Moses, and she impacts the entire future course of Jewish history. She circumcises their son, and she casts the foreskin at the feet of Moses, and she declares, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." What was she saying to Moses here? Zipporah was reminding Moses, when I agreed to be your wife, you told me the history of your family and of your people. You told me about the covenant that God had made with Abraham and of the glorious history-changing mission of your people to perfect the world under the kingship of God. You also told me of the suffering that your people will have to endure and of their ultimate triumph and redemption. Zipporah says, I could have refused to marry you and remain a princess in my father's palace. I could have married within my own people and live a life of luxury. But I came with you, and I accepted the destiny of your people, understanding full well the suffering I would have to endure by being part of God's holy nation. And she took the symbol of circumcision, which is the physical symbol of the covenant, and she cast it at Moses' feet, telling him, "This is the covenant, and you must fulfill your mission and play your role in the historical drama of your people." And Moses then makes his decision, and the inner tension eating him up abates. And then Zipporah triumphantly declares, "My bridegroom of blood to the circumcised." And with this, she charges Moses to go to his people and act as God's agent to redeem them so they can begin their historical march to Sinai, to the Holy Land, and toward the messianic utopia and the perfection of the world.